Welcome to the debate. When a master close-up magician asks you to pick a card, the freedom you feel in that moment is an illusion.
Right, because they engineered the choice.
Exactly. You scan the deck, you take your time, you deliberate, and you make what feels like a completely spontaneous choice. But the magician already knows exactly what you picked because they designed it that way. Today, we're asking if the algorithms powering our digital lives are doing, the exact same thing.
Specifically, when we look at a young social media user, like a teenager scrolling through their phone, where literally every pause, swipe, and lingering gaze is continuously monitored, does the staggering predictive power of artificial intelligence fundamentally infringe upon their freedom of choice?
And I'm going to argue that it doesn't. AI prediction is incredibly sophisticated, sure, but fundamentally it remains a probabilistic tool that maps habits. A probability is not a mandate, meaning true agency and freedom of choice ultimately remain with the user.
See, I look at the exact same mechanics and arrive at the opposite conclusion. Because we aren't just talking about passive prediction or a system that simply takes notes. By anticipating a young user's emotional state and dynamically reorganizing their digital environment to exploit that exact state, the system creates a very powerful illusion of choice.
An illusion, you think?
Absolutely. It doesn't just guess what we will do, it reverse engineers human psychology so deeply that the environment itself does the choosing for you, which I believe undermines free will entirely.
Let's pull back the curtain on how this actually works under the hood. Because the distinction between predicting an outcome and controlling an outcome is everything here. When a platform builds a profile of a teenager, it isn't reading their diary or tracking their conscious thoughts.
No, it's converting their behaviors into vector embeddings.
Right. Every video watched, every half-second hesitation over an ad, the speed of their thumb swipe, all of it gets turned into a coordinate in a massive, high-dimensional space.
And it plots tens of millions of other users in that exact same space.
Exactly. It uses nearest neighbor math to find the cluster of users who behave almost exactly like this specific teenager. If 90% of the people in that specific cluster stopped watching a video at the 12-second mark, the algorithm calculates a 90% probability that our teenager will do the same thing. But here is my central point. 90% is not 100%.
Okay, but you're isolating the math from the application here.
Wait, let me just finish the thought. A probability distribution, fundamentally leaves room for human variance. The system is saying, based on the math, we expect this. It is not saying you are mathematically forced to do this. The teenager holding the phone still has to physically execute the choice.
I get that, but the system doesn't just passively calculate that 90% probability, write it down in a ledger, and observe what happens. It feeds that calculation into a loss function, a mathematical goal the system is actually designed to optimize.
Which is usually engagement or retention.
Exactly. So it doesn't just predict the drop-off at 12 seconds. It dynamically alters the feed to serve a dopamine-triggering notification or an intensely stimulating video at exactly 11.5 seconds. It preempts the user's choice to leave.
Which is a highly effective retention strategy. It's a nudge. But a nudge is still just an anticipation of a state. Let's think about this through an analogy. Imagine a highly observant, deeply dedicated local librarian who has known you for years.
A librarian?
Yeah, bear with me. They know your reading habits perfectly. They know you like science fiction, they know you abandon books with slow first chapters, and they know you usually come in looking for escapism after a stressful week at school.
Okay.
So when you walk in looking completely exhausted and the librarian immediately hands you a fast-paced, thrilling sci-fi novel, they are anticipating your underlying emotional state. But knowing what you want and offering it to you exactly when you need it doesn't mean the librarian is infringing on your freedom to read it or your freedom to walk out of the building.
I'm sorry, but that analogy masks both the scale and the intent of the technology. I mean, a librarian uses conscious human empathy to help you discover something meaningful. They actually want you to read a good book and eventually go to sleep.
Sure, the motivations differ.
They radically differ. A recommendation algorithm uses multidimensional matrix multiplication to compare a teenager to tens of millions of other users in real time, searching for the exact pixel arrangement that will exploit a momentary drop in their cognitive load. A librarian has your best interests at heart. The algorithm is basically a slot machine designer in a cardigan.
A slot machine designer? That seems like quite a leap from a recommendation engine.
It's the exact same underlying mechanism. We are talking about habit loops and reward prediction errors. The brain releases a spike of dopamine not just when it gets a reward, but when it anticipates a reward that is uncertain. The algorithm doesn't just give the teenager exactly what they want every single time.
Right. It varies the content quality.
Right, it mathematically spaces out the highly engaging content between mediocre posts to maximize that uncertainty. It schedules the dopamine release, and it detects when the teenager is most vulnerable.
You mean like late night scrolling?
Yes. If their scroll speed slows down by 14% late at night, the algorithm detects fatigue. It deliberately filters out challenging content and serves up infinitely scrolling, low-resistance videos because it knows their impulse control is offline.
But humans aren't just Pavlov's dogs.
When you deploy billions of parameters to map a teenager's habit loops and then arrange the digital environment to trigger those specific loops when their defenses are down, the fact that they quote-unquote physically execute the choice is irrelevant. The choice architecture has been rigged against their cognitive vulnerabilities.
Well, you're describing classical conditioning, yes. But humans, we have an overarching cognitive layer. Even if we assume the platform is aggressively optimizing for retention, you're ignoring how the user actually feels and responds in that moment. The teenager's not a passive victim lacking all self-awareness.
If they're being nudged by an architecture explicitly built to bypass conscious thought and target instant gratification reflexes, how are they active participants? Reflexes are instinctual, not conscious.
Because they feel the architecture working. There is a very specific, documented psychological effect that happens when you interact with these highly optimized feeds for long enough. You start to feel a subtle tension.
Like realizing it's too accurate?
Yes, exactly. You recognize that the feed is almost too perfect. You feel a quiet unease, as if your impulses have been reverse engineered. You look at a recommendation and think, wow, it really knows I'm stressed today.
A tension born from the subconscious realization that you are being managed by a machine.
Yes, but the very existence of that tension is proof of their enduring agency. If the AI had truly overridden their free will, if they were simply automatons following a mathematically engineered script, there would be no unease whatsoever. They would just consume perfectly, seamlessly, and thoughtlessly.
I'm not sure that's enough to say free will.
The fact that a 16-year-old can sit there, look at their feed, and recognize the illusion that they can feel the unease of being predicted is the mechanism of their freedom. That meta-awareness allows them to step back, evaluate the nudge, and consciously choose to swipe away.
But you are relying on a fleeting moment of meta-awareness to save them from a system designed to operate below the threshold of conscious awareness. You're asking a tired teenager to constantly outthink a supercomputer that has mapped their reflexes better than they have.
It doesn't take outthinking a supercomputer to just close an app.
Yes, they might catch the algorithm showing its hand once in a while and feel that tension. But what about the other 99 times when the transition is so seamless, so perfectly aligned with their latent desires that they don't feel the tension at all? What happens to genuine spontaneity? The quiet surveillance of habits makes making a truly spontaneous decision practically impossible for a young user today.
I don't follow that logic. How does spontaneity become impossible? If I randomly decide to look up a video about ancient Rome instead of my usual gaming streams, that's me actively breaking the pattern. That is spontaneity.
Is it, though? Let's go back to that high-dimensional vector space you brought up earlier.
Sure.
To the teenager, the decision to switch from gaming streams to a history documentary feels like a spontaneous act of free will. But in the latent space, that random jump was mathematically modeled. The algorithm tracks how user attention drifts when they hit a saturation point with one specific topic.
So you're saying it predicted the drift?
Exactly. It saw the fatigue with gaming content, calculated an 85% probability of a pattern break, and seeded that history thumbnail exactly where the user's eye would catch it 3 scrolls later. The teenager feels spontaneous, but to the model, it is simply the latest confirmation of a trajectory it already mapped. The algorithm knew the user was due for a break, calculated what that break would look like, and position the exit ramp perfectly. The spontaneity is completely hollow.
Okay, that's a fascinating way to frame it. But I don't buy the idea that the walls are constantly shifting to trap them, because we know mechanically how to break the walls down. The system operates on probabilities, which means it requires high confidence scores to function perfectly. A user can profoundly weaken the system's confidence by introducing intentional friction.
Intentional friction? Meaning what, practically?
Meaning poisoning the data, injecting noise into the vector space. Because the algorithm relies on a continuous feedback loop of predictable behavior, a young user can purposefully engage with content far outside their established clusters.
Wait, so just clicking random things?
Right, they can routinely skip the most obvious highly ranked recommendations. They can force themselves to pause for 10 seconds before clicking a notification. They can aggressively clear their app caches and reset their histories. Every time they introduce this deliberate noise, the model's confidence threshold drops. The probability distribution flattens out. The predictions become less precise.
So the solution to algorithmic determinism is for a 16-year-old to become a data obfuscation expert?
It's not about being an expert. It's about exercising the agency that still clearly exists. Over time, by introducing friction, you train not just the algorithm, but your own neural pathways. Your decisions become driven less by invisible nudges and more by your own conscious reflection. The fact that you have the mechanical power to degrade the algorithm's certainty proves that freedom of choice is fully intact. You just have to be willing to exercise it.
Listen to the vocabulary you're using, though. Intentional friction. Poison the data. Degrade the certainty.
Well, it's the technical reality of how you manage machine learning models.
It's the reality of a hostile environment. Think about the baseline state of the digital environment you are describing. If the baseline state of a social media platform requires a young user to fight a daily guerrilla war against their own feed.
A guerrilla war is a bit strong.
Is it? If they have to artificially scramble their behavior, manually inject noise, and constantly monitor their own impulses just to experience a genuinely free choice, then the environment is fundamentally coercive.
Coercive implies force.
I would describe it as heavily optimized.
Optimized against the user's agency. If you have to fight tooth and nail to reclaim your unpredictability, it proves that your freedom of choice was infringed upon in the first place. You don't have to launch a counterinsurgency to reclaim something that was never taken from you.
I see your point, but I still think
The reality is that the algorithm's forecast is the default state. The environment defaults to exploiting habit loops and emotional triggers linked to reward and relief. Yes, a highly vigilant teenager can fight against their own recommendation feed to introduce genuine surprises, but that is an exhausting burden of agency. The fact that freedom requires constant, exhausting friction against the designed environment is the ultimate proof that the environment is hostile to free will.
That's a really compelling counterpoint, though I would frame the nature of that environment differently. I don't see it as a hostile environment trying to trap us. I see it as an environment of unprecedented, almost uncomfortable clarity.
Clarity? How so?
Think about human history. Before machine learning algorithms, human beings were still driven by fatigue. We were still trapped in habit loops. We still sought out instant gratification and confirmation bias. We just didn't have a mathematical model reflecting it back to us in real time.
Are you suggesting the AI is just a mirror?
I am. It is a highly accurate, statistically derived mirror. It reflects back to us when we are tired, when we are impulsive, and when our cognitive defenses are low. It forces us to confront how wildly predictable our human behaviors actually are. We like to think of ourselves as wholly unpredictable, infinitely complex creatures. But the vector space shows that in the aggregate, we are incredibly repetitive. If anything, having a technology that points out our predictable nature is the first necessary step to actually exerting free will. We can finally see the invisible strings of our own habits.
But a mirror is passive. It just reflects the light that hits it. A recommendation engine dynamically reorganizes the reflection to keep you staring at the glass. If you were tired before smartphones, you might just fall asleep. Your habit loop would end in rest.
Sure, but
Now the algorithm detects the micro-hesitations in your scroll that indicate cognitive depletion, and it immediately serves up a customized stream of low-resistance content to keep your eyes open. It alters the choice architecture. It suppresses the difficult option, which is putting the phone down, and heavily lubricates the easy option. It is an active, optimizing participant that shapes the outcome.
it is an active participant in the feedback loop, yes. But a feedback loop requires two active nodes. The algorithm serves the low-resistance content, but the user still has to consume it. The user's behavior trains the AI, and the AI adapts. If the AI shapes the environment so the next choice follows the same script, the user still retains the physical and cognitive ability to break the script.
That's a big if, though.
Well, because the human brain possesses incredible neuroplasticity, we can rewire our own responses just as we retrain the algorithm. It requires effort, I completely concede that. But requiring effort to make a choice is not the same thing as lacking the power to choose.
Only if they possess the awareness of how deeply the AI reads their behavior. And for many young users, that awareness is completely obscured by the sheer seamlessness of the technology. The unease might be subtle, but the gratification is instant and engineered perfectly for their specific brain chemistry.
I hear ya. It's certainly a heavy lift for the user.
Right. When an algorithm knows your rhythms better than you do and uses that asymmetrical knowledge to nudge you toward its own expected outcomes, it creates an illusion of freedom that is incredibly difficult to pierce. When the effort required to maintain autonomy vastly exceeds the effort required to surrender to the nudge, the architecture itself is doing the choosing. The doors are technically unlocked, but the floor is tilted at a 45-degree angle toward the exit the platform wants you to take.
And yet, the fact that we can analyze the angle of that floor and actively choose to walk uphill demonstrates that the illusion can be pierced. I think we've mapped the boundaries of this remarkably well today. To synthesize my position, while AI certainly holds a profoundly accurate mirror to our behavioral rhythms and vulnerabilities, it remains a system built on statistical probabilities. It anticipates and it certainly nudges, but it cannot ultimately compel, because we retain the power to introduce intentional friction, to pause, to inject noise into our data, and to consciously retrain our own habits. We remain the sole authors of our choices. The tool is powerful, but human cognitive agency is resilient.
And to summarize my stance, when an algorithm goes beyond mere observation to actively leverage our psychological vulnerabilities, our fatigue, our habit loops, our desire for uncertain rewards, it crosses the line from prediction to manipulation. By shaping the digital environment to nudge a young user toward outcomes optimized for someone else's engagement metrics, the resulting choices they make are heavily compromised. The sheer necessity of having to constantly fight the system to reclaim our unpredictability demonstrates that our baseline freedom has in fact been infringed upon. We are left with a powerful, mathematically engineered illusion of choice.
I think where we absolutely converge today is on the astonishing, almost unsettling fidelity of these behavioral models. The fact that a combination of dwell times, swipe speeds, and micro-interactions can map high-dimensional latent space into such a high-resolution portrait of human psychology is incredible.
It is. And we also converge on the profound psychological shift this creates. The tension of realizing you are deeply known by a machine, that your latent desires and spontaneous whims are just coordinates in an algorithm's forecast, fundamentally and permanently changes our relationship with our own minds.
It certainly does. Navigating this digital world requires wrestling constantly with the trade-off between seamless personalization and the deeply human desire for genuine unpredictability. We will leave it to you, the listener, to determine the true extent of your own digital free will.
It is a question every user has to answer for themselves every single time they pick up their device.
Indeed. Think back to that close-up magician we started with. The deck is in their hands, the cards are fanned out perfectly before you, and they are waiting with a knowing smile. You reach your hand out to pick a card, but are you really the one choosing?